One.
Greetings, brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen. There are many people in the world today who believe the claim, or who make the claim, that descendants of the Africans who were taken to the Americas through the transatlantic slave trade are Israelites. That claim is founded upon a number of arguments. The principal one of those arguments is that the transatlantic slave trade was a fulfillment of the curses which the Israelites were told would befall them and which are recorded in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 28. It leans especially on verse 68 of that chapter, which says that the Israelites will be taken back to Egypt in ships where they will offer themselves for sale as bondmen and bondwomen. And so the reasoning goes that if the transatlantic slave trade was a fulfillment of the curses of Deuteronomy chapter 28, then its victims must have been Israelites. And for that reason, their descendants, many of who are the present-day African Americans, are therefore Israelites. That argument has three problems. The first problem is that the transatlantic slave trade is being proposed to be a fulfillment of the curses of Deuteronomy chapter 28 in the context of an effort to demonstrate or to prove that its victims were Israelites. That proof is needed only because we do not know otherwise that its victims were Israelites. And yet, without knowing otherwise that its victims were Israelites, we cannot conclude that the transatlantic slave trade fulfilled the curses of Deuteronomy chapter 28, because that is one of the conditions which an event such as the transatlantic slave trade needs to satisfy in order to be judged the fulfillment of the curses of Deuteronomy chapter 28. Obviously, if the transatlantic slave trade involved people other than Israelites, then it could not be a fulfillment of those curses. And so it is evident that this argument is circular in nature. An argument is circular if the premise that must be true in order for its conclusion to be true can only be true if that conclusion is true. In other words, for the conclusion to be true, the premise must be true. But for the premise to be true, the conclusion must be true. In the particular case of this argument, the premise which must be true in order for the conclusion to be true that the victims of the transatlantic slave trade were Israelites is that the transatlantic slave trade fulfilled the curses of Deuteronomy chapter 28. But in order for it to be true that the transatlantic slave trade fulfilled the curses of Deuteronomy chapter 28, then its victims must be Israelites. Circular arguments are effective only at persuading those who already believe their conclusions, and this one is no exception. It avails only to persuade those who already believe that African Americans are Israelites, and that is the first problem. The second problem is that verse 68 of Deuteronomy chapter 28 identifies the place that the Israelites were to be taken back to in ships as Egypt, and also as a place which our Creator told their ancestors that they were never again to see. The place that the transatlantic slave trade took its victims to is not Egypt, nor had the ancestors of those victims ever been to that place, so that it would make no sense to tell them that they were never again to see that place. It is simply not true what some people have claimed, that Moses used the name Egypt in that verse, not in its literal sense, but rather to symbolize bondage, because for what purpose would he want to symbolize bondage in the very same sentence in which he says plainly that the Israelites would sell themselves into bondage. Those who make that claim know in their hearts that the real reason why they are making that claim is in order to enable the interpretation of verse 68 to stretch sufficiently to accommodate the transatlantic slave trade. Because the reality is that the transatlantic slave trade does not satisfy the conditions to be a fulfillment of the curses of Deuteronomy chapter 28 in general and verse 68 in particular. And that is the second problem. The third problem is that accepting that the transatlantic slave trade was a fulfillment of the curses of Deuteronomy chapter 28 is not essential for those curses to stand fulfilled. There were other events in history which much better satisfy the conditions to be a fulfillment of the curses of Deuteronomy chapter 28 than the transatlantic slave trade. The letter of Aristeas, for example, testifies that at the time when it was written, which was about 200 BCE, there were not less than 100,000 Israelites living in bondage in Egypt, having been forcibly transported there by the father of the Greek king who was then ruling Egypt and whose name was Ptolemy II. You can read the full text of the letter of Aristeas at the link which I have provided in the description box below this video. Embedded in the letter of Aristeas is another letter which King Ptolemy II wrote to the high priest in Jerusalem, and in which he reveals that the so-called Persians who ruled Egypt before the Greeks had also transported a large number of Israelites to Egypt and put them in bondage there. It is a well-documented fact that following the destruction of Jerusalem, the Romans also transported several thousand Israelites to Egypt and put them in bondage there. This is the same Egypt which our Creator delivered the Israelites from bondage in several hundred years before and told them that they were never again to see. And so it is apparent that these events much better satisfy the conditions to be a fulfillment of the curses of Deuteronomy chapter 28 than the transatlantic slave trade. Perhaps the one thing that might confuse some is why our Creator would choose ships as the means to take the Israelites back to Egypt in, when it appears easier and more convenient to transport prisoners overland to Egypt from the general area where the country that is presently called Israel is located. That confusion goes away once it is understood that the place that the Israelites were being transported to Egypt from is the land which our Creator promised to Abraham and his descendants, and that the country that is presently called Israel is not sitting on that land. On this channel there is a short video which provides the proof that in fact the land which our Creator promised to Abraham and his descendants is located to the south of Egypt and borders upon the Nile River. History also bears witness that there were vessels which sailed up and down the Nile River, and which English translations of ancient writings, of which the Bible is one, refer to as ships. In fact, the Roman general Titus, who later became Emperor of Rome, is reported by Flavius Josephus in his book Wars of the Jews to have sailed the Nile River with a detachment of Roman soldiers in vessels which he calls ships during part of the journey that he made from Alexandria in Egypt to go and assume command of the Roman forces in Judea, which under his command went on to destroy Jerusalem. That is evidence that the journey between Egypt and the Promised Land could feasibly be undertaken, if not conveniently, by sailing at least part of the way in vessels which are called, in ancient writings, ships. Therefore, while we do not have direct evidence that the Israelites who were in bondage in Egypt arrived there in ships, that absence of evidence does not constitute evidence that they did not, nor can it be ruled out that they arrived Egypt in ships merely based on the location of Egypt relative to the Promised Land. And so looking at this information in conjunction with other information surrounding this topic, the conclusion cannot easily be escaped that while there is no doubt that some of the African Americans who traced their descent to the Africans that were taken to the Americas through the transatlantic slave trade are Israelites, tracing one's descent to those Africans does not make a person an Israelite. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and have a good day. Bye-bye.